Captain Marcus Whitfield stood motionless at his post outside St. James's Palace. His scarlet tunic immaculate, and his bearskin hat positioned with military precision. To the hundreds of tourists who passed by each day, he was simply another royal guard, a living statue performing ceremonial duties. But behind his stoic expression lay the weight of 15 years of unwavering service, spotless record, and a reputation as one of the most disciplined soldiers in the entire household division. At 33 years old, Marcus had dedicated his entire adult life to the crown. He had joined the Coldstream Guards straight from school, driven by a deep sense of duty that had been instilled in him by his father. A career military man who had served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, Marcus's rise through the ranks had been steady and earned through merit, never through shortcuts or political connections. His superiors trusted him implicitly. His subordinates respected him, and his fellow guards looked up to him as an example of what a royal guard should be. The morning of September 15th started like any other. Marcus had risen at 5:30, completed his morning routine with military precision, and arrived at the palace grounds 30 minutes before his shift began. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his boots shined to a mirror finish, and his mind focused on the 8-hour duty that lay ahead. He had performed this routine thousands of times, and it had become as natural as breathing. What Marcus didn't know was that this particular day would test every principle he held dear and force him to choose between his sworn duty and his deepest personal beliefs. The event that would shatter his carefully constructed world was already in motion, though he wouldn't discover it for several hours yet. The palace was preparing for a private ceremony, not a grand state occasion that would draw media attention, but a smaller, more intimate gathering that still required the full protocol and security that came with any royal event. Marcus had been specifically chosen to oversee the guard detail for this ceremony, a testament to his reputation for flawless execution of duties. As he took his position, Marcus noticed an unusual amount of activity in the staff quarters. Servants were moving with particular urgency, and there seemed to be more coordination between the palace staff and the external event planners than was typical for a private function. Still, it wasn't his place to question the nature of the event. His job was to ensure security and maintain the dignity of the crown, regardless of the specifics of what was happening inside the palace walls. The first guests began arriving around noon. They were well-dressed, but not with the formal grandeur typically associated with major royal events. Marcus observed them with the trained eye of a security professional, noting faces, assessing potential risks, and ensuring that the established protocols were being followed. Everything seemed routine and proper. Among the arriving guests was a young man in his late 20s, impeccably dressed in morning attire, who carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to privilege. He was accompanied by an older gentleman who appeared to be his father, a man whose bearing and dress suggested significant wealth and social standing. They moved through the security checkpoint with the ease of people who were familiar with such procedures. Marcus paid particular attention to this pair, not because they seemed suspicious, but because there was something about the younger man's demeanor that struck him as unusual. While most guests at royal events displayed a mixture of excitement and nervous respect, this young man seemed almost casual, as if he were attending a business meeting rather than a ceremony at one of Britain's most sacred institutions. As the afternoon wore on, more details about the ceremony began to filter through the staff communications. Marcus learned that it was a wedding, not a royal wedding, but a private ceremony being held for a member of the extended royal household. Such events were not uncommon, and Marcus had overseen security for dozens of similar occasions throughout his career. What he didn't yet know was the identity of the groom or the circumstances that had led to this particular union. The information would come to him gradually, through overheard conversations and glimpses of documentation, building a picture that would ultimately challenge everything he believed about honor, duty, and the institution he had sworn to serve. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 3 o'clock. As guests filed into the palace chapel, Marcus maintained his position, ensuring that the perimeter remained secure and that protocol was observed. His fellow guards were positioned at strategic points throughout the grounds, all of them maintaining the same level of alertness and professionalism that had made the household division famous throughout the world. At 2:30, Marcus received word through his earpiece that the bridal party was preparing to arrive. This was always a critical moment in any ceremony, as it required precise coordination between the guards, the palace staff, and the external security detail. Marcus had orchestrated hundreds of such arrivals, and he took pride in ensuring that everything proceeded smoothly. The first indication that something was different came when Marcus noticed several of the senior palace staff exchanging concerned glances. There was a tension in the air that went beyond the normal pre-ceremony preparations. Phone calls were being made in hushed tones, and there seemed to be some kind of last-minute coordination taking place that hadn't been part of the original plan. As the minutes ticked toward 3 o'clock, Marcus found himself focusing not just on the security aspects of his duty, but on the subtle signs that something significant was happening. His years of experience had taught him to read the atmosphere around royal events, and there was something about this particular ceremony that felt different from the routine private functions he had overseen in the past. The stage was being set for a confrontation between duty and conscience that would test the very foundations of Marcus's belief in the institution he had served with such dedication. The choices he would face in the coming hours would force him to examine what it truly meant to serve with honor, and whether blind obedience was always the highest form of loyalty. At exactly 3 o'clock, the bridal car arrived at the palace gates. Marcus watched through his peripheral vision as a young woman in an elegant white dress stepped out of the vehicle, assisted by what appeared to be her father. She was beautiful, probably in her early 20s, with dark hair arranged in an elaborate style beneath a delicate tiara. Her dress was understated but clearly expensive, appropriate for a private royal ceremony. What immediately caught Marcus's attention, however, was not the bride's appearance, but her demeanor. Unlike most brides he had observed at royal ceremonies, she seemed subdued, almost reluctant. Her smile appeared forced, and there was something in her posture that suggested she was being supported not just physically by her father's arm, but emotionally as well. Her eyes, which should have been bright with joy on her wedding day, seemed distant and troubled. As the bridal party made their way toward the chapel entrance, Marcus overheard fragments of conversation from the palace staff members coordinating the arrival. The words arrangement, settlement, and family obligations drifted to his ears, spoken in the hushed tones that palace staff used when discussing sensitive matters. While Marcus had learned to filter out most of the gossip and speculation that was constant in the palace environment, these particular words made him pay closer attention. It was then that Marcus recognized the groom waiting at the chapel entrance. Lord Geoffrey Ashworth, the son of a prominent conservative politician, and heir to a significant fortune built on defense contracts and international business dealings. Marcus knew the name from the society pages and political news, but more importantly, he knew it from intelligence briefings that had crossed his desk in recent months. Geoffrey Ashworth had been the subject of several quiet investigations by palace security. There had been allegations of financial impropriety, questions about his business connections in countries with questionable human rights records, and rumors about his personal conduct that had never quite risen to the level of public scandal but had been serious enough to warrant official attention. While none of these allegations had resulted in formal charges, they had painted a picture of a man whose character was, at best, questionable. As Marcus processed this information, he began to understand why the atmosphere around the ceremony felt so tense. This wasn't a love match or even a typical arranged marriage between compatible aristocratic families. This appeared to be something else entirely, a transaction designed to solve problems for both families involved. The bride's family name was Catherine Pemberton, and as Marcus recalled the intelligence briefings he had reviewed, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The Pemberton family had been facing serious financial difficulties. Following a series of failed investments and some questionable business decisions by Catherine's father, there had been whispers about potential bankruptcy and the loss of the family estate that had been in their possession for over 2 centuries. The marriage, Marcus realized, was likely a financial arrangement. Geoffrey Ashworth would gain social standing and respectability through marriage to a woman from an old aristocratic family. While the Pembertons would gain access to the Ashworth fortune and the political connections that came with it, Catherine herself was apparently the price being paid to secure her family's future. As this understanding dawned on Marcus, he felt something he had rarely experienced in his 15 years of service, a profound conflict between his duty as a guard and his conscience as a human being. He was witnessing what appeared to be a young woman being essentially sold into marriage to preserve her family's social and financial position. And the ceremony was taking place under the auspices of the royal household that he had sworn to protect and serve. The internal struggle that began in that moment would only intensify as the ceremony progressed. Marcus watched as Catherine was escorted into the chapel, her steps measured and mechanical rather than joyful. Her father walked beside her with the bearing of a man completing a difficult but necessary business transaction, while Geoffrey waited at the altar with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully negotiated a favorable deal. During the ceremony, Marcus maintained his position outside the chapel, but he could hear the proceedings through the partially open doors. The vows, which should have been declarations of love and commitment, sounded hollow and rehearsed. Catherine's voice was barely audible as she spoke the words that would bind her to a man she had known for less than 6 months, and even from his position outside, Marcus could sense the reluctance in her responses. What made the situation even more troubling was the presence of several high-ranking palace officials, who were not only attending the ceremony, but appeared to be actively facilitating it. This wasn't simply a private ceremony happening to take place on royal property. It was an event that had received official sanction and support from the very institution that Marcus had dedicated his life to serving. As the ceremony concluded and the newlyweds emerged from the chapel, Marcus observed Catherine's face closely. Instead of the joy and relief that typically marked the end of a wedding ceremony, her expression was one of resignation and barely concealed distress. Geoffrey, meanwhile, was beaming with satisfaction, already discussing business matters with his father and several other guests as if his new wife were merely another acquisition to be managed. The reception that followed was held in one of the palace's private dining rooms. Marcus and his team maintained security for the event, but their position allowed them to observe the interactions between the guests. What Marcus saw confirmed his worst fears about the nature of the marriage he had just witnessed. Catherine sat at the head table looking isolated and overwhelmed, while Geoffrey networked with the other guests using his new marital status to strengthen business and political relationships. At one point, Marcus overheard Geoffrey describing the marriage as a perfect strategic alliance to a group of businessmen, speaking about his wife as if she were not sitting just a few feet away. The moment that would ultimately drive Marcus to break his 15-year record of perfect discipline came during the reception. Catherine excused herself from the main gathering and stepped onto a small balcony that was within Marcus's line of sight. Thinking herself alone, she allowed her composure to break completely. The tears she had been holding back throughout the ceremony finally came, and Marcus watched as she sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking with the weight of what she had just committed herself to. It was then that Marcus made a decision that would change the course of his career and his life. For the first time in his service as a royal guard, he was going to break protocol in a way that would send shockwaves through the institution I had served with such unwavering loyalty. Marcus stood frozen at his post, watching Catherine on the balcony as she wept. Every fiber of his training told him to maintain his position, to ignore what was happening, and to focus solely on his security duties. But as he watched this young woman's anguish, something deeper than military discipline began to stir within him, a sense of basic human decency that refused to be silenced by protocol. The internal battle that raged in Marcus's mind was unlike anything he had ever experienced. For 15 years, he had prided himself on his ability to separate his personal feelings from his professional duties. He had stood guard during ceremonies he personally disagreed with, had protected people whose actions he privately questioned, and had maintained perfect discipline regardless of his own opinions or emotions. It was what made him an exceptional royal guard, but this was different. This wasn't about politics or policies he might disagree with. This was about witnessing what appeared to be a fundamental violation of human dignity taking place under the protection of the institution he had sworn to serve. Catherine wasn't a political figure making questionable decisions. She was a victim. And her suffering was happening with the tacit approval of people Marcus had spent his career respecting and protecting. As Catherine continued to cry on the balcony, Marcus found himself remembering his own sister, who was about the same age. He thought about how he would feel if Sarah were in Catherine's position, trapped in a loveless marriage to a man of questionable character for the sake of family financial obligations. The thought filled him with a rage that he had never experienced. While in uniform, Marcus glanced around at his fellow guards and the palace officials managing the event. None of them seemed to be paying any attention to Catherine's distress. They were all focused on their assigned duties, maintaining the smooth operation of the reception, while completely ignoring the human cost of what they were facilitating. Their indifference struck Marcus as almost more troubling than the marriage itself. It was at that moment that Marcus made his decision. Moving slowly and deliberately, he stepped away from his assigned position and walked toward the balcony where Catherine stood. Each step felt like a violation of everything he had been trained to do, but he couldn't bring himself to stop. His years of perfect discipline were about to end, and he knew it. Catherine looked up in surprise as she heard footsteps approaching. Her tears had streaked her makeup, and her elaborate hairstyle had begun to come undone. Approaching in his full dress uniform, her first instinct was alarm. Had she broken some protocol by stepping outside? Was she in trouble for being away from the reception? "Milady?" Marcus said quietly, his voice gentle but firm. "Are you all right?" The simple question seemed to catch Catherine completely off guard. For a moment, she just stared at him, as if she couldn't believe that someone in his position would break protocol to express concern for her well-being. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I'm fine," she said, though. Her tear-stained face made the lie obvious to both of them. Marcus stepped closer, positioning himself so that they couldn't be easily observed from inside the reception hall. "With respect, my lady, you don't appear to be fine. And if I may say so, what I witnessed today didn't seem like a celebration, but rather like ... double quotes." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Like someone being forced into a situation against her will?" Catherine's composure broke completely at his words. "You don't understand," she said between sobs. "My family. We're going to lose everything. The estate, the house where my grandmother was born, where my children were supposed to grow up. Jeffrey's family offered to pay all our debts to save everything, but only if you married him," Marcus finished quietly. She nodded, unable to speak through her tears. "My father says it's my duty to the family, that this is what aristocratic daughters have always done, made sacrifices to preserve the family legacy. He says I'll learn to be content with Jeffrey, that love isn't as important as security and respectability." Marcus felt his anger building, not at Catherine, but at the system that had put her in this position. "My lady, may I speak plainly?" Catherine looked up at him, surprised by the question. In her world, guards and servants didn't ask permission to speak plainly. They simply followed orders and maintained their assigned roles. "Please," she said. "I've served this institution for 15 years, Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've believed in the principles it represents: honor, duty, service to something greater than ourselves. But what I've witnessed today isn't honor. It's the use of tradition and institutional authority to cover up what is essentially human trafficking." Catherine's eyes widened at his blunt words, but she didn't interrupt. "You're being traded like property to solve your family's financial problems," Marcus continued. "And the man you've been given to has a reputation that should make any father ashamed to put his daughter in his hands. This isn't duty or honor, it's cowardice disguised as tradition." For several minutes they stood in silence. Catherine had stopped crying, but her face showed the internal struggle of someone hearing truths. It challenged everything she had been taught about duty and family obligation. "But what choice do I have?" she finally asked. "Family loses everything. My younger siblings won't be able to go to university. My parents will lose the home they've lived in for 30 years. How can I be so selfish as to put my own happiness above their security?" Marcus had been asking himself the same question about his own situation. How could he put his personal convictions above his duty to the crown? How could he justify breaking the oath he had taken when he joined the royal guard? "My lady," he said slowly, "I think we both know that there's a difference between duty and slavery. Real duty, real honor, sometimes requires us to stand up against systems that are wrong, even when those systems are ones we've been taught to respect." As he spoke these words, Marcus realized he was not just trying to convince Catherine, but also preparing himself for what he was about to do. His decision to approach her had been impulsive, driven by compassion and outrage. But what he was considering now was something much more calculated and deliberate, an act of rebellion that would end his career and probably destroy his life as he knew it. "What are you saying?" Catherine asked, though something in her expression suggested she was beginning to understand. Marcus looked back toward the reception hall, where Jeffrey was holding court with a group of businessmen, already treating his new wife's absence as insignificant. Then he looked back at Catherine and made the decision that would define the rest of both their lives. "I'm saying that sometimes the most honorable thing a person can do is refuse to participate in something fundamentally wrong, regardless of the consequences," Marcus said, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he was contemplating. "And I'm saying that you don't have to go through with this." Catherine stared at him in shock. "What do you mean? The ceremony's over. I'm married now. There's no going back." Marcus shook his head. "The ceremony was completed under duress. You were coerced into this marriage to save your family from financial ruin. In a court of law, that would be grounds for annulment. But, more importantly, just because something is legal doesn't make it right." He moved closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear him. "I know this sounds impossible, but you could leave right now. Tonight, before this goes any further. Leave." Catherine's voice was barely a whisper. "And go where? Do what?" "I have no money of my own, no skills beyond what's expected of an aristocratic daughter. I wouldn't survive a week on my own." "You wouldn't be on your own," Marcus said, surprised by his own words as he spoke them. "I have savings enough to help you get started somewhere new. I have contacts outside the palace, people who could help you find work, a place to live." Catherine stepped back, staring at him as if he had suggested they flee to another planet. "You're talking about throwing away your entire life for someone? You've known for 5 minutes. Why would you do such a thing?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, asking himself the same question. Why was he willing to destroy his career, his reputation, everything he had worked for, to help a woman he had never spoken to before today? Because, he said finally, "I joined the royal guard to serve honor and justice." No. And what's happening? Here isn't honorable or just. It's the abuse of power and tradition to cover up something that should be criminal. If I stand by and do nothing, I'm not serving honor, I'm betraying it. Looking directly into her eyes. "But more than that, I've watched you today. I've seen your strength, your grace under pressure, your willingness to sacrifice your own happiness for your family. You deserve better than being treated like a commodity to be traded. You deserve a chance at real happiness, at a life chosen, rather than imposed." Catherine was crying again, but these were different tears, not the hopeless sobs of earlier, but tears of someone who was beginning to see a possibility she hadn't imagined. "Even if what you're suggesting were possible," she said, "what about my family? I'll still lose everything if I leave." Marcus had been thinking about this too. Your family's financial problems aren't your responsibility to solve by sacrificing your life. There are other ways to address debt and financial difficulties, ways that don't involve selling a daughter into marriage, which maybe losing the estate, would be better for them in the long run than keeping it through such means. As they talked, Marcus kept one eye on the reception hall. So far, no one seemed to have noticed Catherine's extended absence, but that wouldn't last long. Jeffrey would eventually look for his new wife, and when he did, Marcus's absence from his post would also be discovered. "If we're going to do this," Marcus said urgently, "it has to be now. In another hour, it will be too late. The reception will end. You'll be expected to leave with Jeffrey, and any chance of escape will be gone." Catherine looked toward the reception hall where her new, Husband was still networking, completely oblivious to her absence. Then she looked back at Marcus, this man in uniform who was willing to throw away everything he had worked for to offer her a chance at freedom. "You don't even know me," she said. "What if I'm not the person you think I am? What if I'm weak, or selfish, or unable to handle a life outside of this privileged bubble?" Marcus smiled for the first time since the conversation began. "My lady, you've spent your entire life being told what to do, what to think, what to want. I've never had the chance to find out who you really are. That alone makes you braver than most people I know." He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. "I have a friend who works for a women's refuge organization. She helps women escape from abusive situations. What you're in may be legal, but it's still a form of abuse. She could have someone here in 30 minutes to take you somewhere safe." Catherine stared at the phone as if it were a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. "If I do this," she said slowly, "what happens to you?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "I'll be court-martialed for abandoning my post and interfering with official palace business. I'll lose my commission, my pension, probably face criminal charges. My family will be humiliated. My father will never speak to me again, and I'll never work in security or law enforcement again. And how can I ask you to do this?" "You're not asking me," Marcus replied. "I'm choosing to do it because it's the right thing to do. Because some things are more important than career and reputation. Because I'd rather lose everything while standing up for what's right than keep everything while staying silent about." "What's wrong?" Catherine closed her eyes, and Marcus could see her wrestling with the decision that would determine the rest of her life. When she opened them again, there was a strength in her gaze that hadn't been there before. "Make the call," she said. Marcus dialed his friend's number, his hands steady, despite the magnitude of what he was setting in motion. As the phone rang, he looked back at the reception hall one more time. In 30 minutes, chaos would erupt. When both the bride and one of the guards disappeared, in an hour, his 15-year career would be over. By tomorrow, he would be facing charges that could send him to prison. But as he heard his friend answer the phone and began to explain the situation, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that he was doing the right thing, regardless of the cost. The next 20 minutes passed like a blur of careful planning and mounting tension. Marcus's friend Sarah, who ran a network of safe houses for women escaping domestic abuse, didn't ask questions when Marcus explained that he needed immediate help for someone in danger. She had worked with him before on cases involving military families, and she trusted his judgment completely. "There's a car coming," Marcus told Catherine as he ended the call. "It will be here in 15 minutes. The driver will park at the service entrance on the east side of the palace grounds. You'll need to slip away from the reception and meet them there." Catherine nodded, but Marcus could see the fear in her eyes as the reality of what they were planning began to sink in. "What do I tell people? How do I just disappear from my own wedding reception? Tell them you need some air, or that you're feeling unwell from all the excitement? Most people will understand that a bride might need a few minutes alone. Time anyone realizes you're really gone, you'll be safely away from here." Marcus reached into his inner pocket and pulled out an envelope containing his life savings money. He had been setting aside for years with the vague intention of eventually buying a house when he retired from service. "This isn't much, but it's enough to get you started somewhere new. Sarah will help you find a place to stay and figure out your next steps." Catherine stared at the envelope, overwhelmed by the generosity of this man who had known her for less than an hour. "Marcus, I can't take your money. You're already risking everything to help me." "Money can be replaced," Marcus said simply. "Your life can't be. Take it." As Catherine accepted the envelope, Marcus heard voices from inside the reception hall. Growing louder, it sounded like people were beginning to notice the bride's absence. They were running out of time. "You need to go back in there for a few minutes," Marcus said urgently. "Make an appearance. Let people see you. Then make your excuse about needing air. If you disappear now, they'll start looking for you immediately." Catherine took a deep breath, straightening her dress and trying to repair her appearance. "What about you? Won't they notice that you've left your post?" Marcus had been dreading this moment. Once Catherine left the palace grounds, his own role in her escape would become obvious. There would be no way to deny what he had done or why he had done it. I'm going to return to my position and maintain it until you're safely away, he said. Once you're gone, I'll turn myself in to my commanding officer and explain what happened. It's better if I take responsibility immediately rather than try to cover it up. Catherine reached out and touched his arm. The first physical contact. Between them, you're the most honorable man I've ever met, she said quietly. And I'll never forget what you've done for me. Just promise me you'll make it count, Marcus replied. Build a life that's worth what we're both giving up today. Catherine slipped back into the reception while Marcus returned to his post. To any observer, it would have appeared that nothing had happened. The guard was back at his position. The bride was mingling with her guests, but both of them were acutely aware that they were living through the final minutes of their old lives. Marcus watched through the windows as Catherine moved through the reception, smiling and accepting congratulations, while inside she must have been terrified. She played her role perfectly, giving no sign of what she was planning. After about 10 minutes, she approached Jeffrey and spoke to him quietly. Marcus saw him nod dismissively, already turning back to his business conversation as Catherine excused herself. She walked calmly toward the palace's east wing, and Marcus felt his heart pounding as he realized there was no turning back now. In 5 minutes, she would be in the car driving toward freedom. In 10 minutes, people would realize she was missing. In 15 minutes, his career would be over as Catherine disappeared from view. Marcus found himself thinking about his father, who had been so proud when Marcus was accepted into the royal guard. He thought about his sister, who bragged to her friends about her brother who protected the royal family. He thought about his fellow guards who would feel betrayed by his actions. The personal cost of what he was doing was enormous, but as he stood at his post, watching the reception continue inside while knowing that Catherine was escaping from what amounted to a prison sentence, Marcus felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in his military career, he wasn't just following orders or maintaining protocol, he was actively fighting for justice. The car arrived exactly on schedule. Marcus couldn't see it from his position, but he knew it was there. In his mind, he followed Catherine's journey through the palace corridors, down the service stairs, past the kitchens, and out to the waiting vehicle. Every step took her further from the life that had been imposed on her and closer to the possibility of choosing her own future. 10 minutes later, the first signs of alarm began to appear. A palace staff member came looking for Catherine, checking the obvious places where a bride might go for a quiet moment. When the balcony and nearby rooms turned up empty, the search became more urgent. Jeffrey was notified, and Marcus watched through the window as the groom's face transformed from mild annoyance to genuine concern to growing anger. Palace security was alerted, and within minutes, a systematic search of the entire building was underway. It was then that someone noticed Marcus standing motionless at his post, maintaining perfect military bearing even as chaos erupted around him. One of his fellow guards approached him. Marcus, have you seen Lady Catherine? She seems to have disappeared from the reception. Marcus looked his colleague directly in the eye. Yes, he said simply. I helped her leave. The words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't yet exploded. His fellow guard stared at him in shock, unable to process what he had just heard. You ... what, Marcus? What are you talking about? I helped Lady Catherine escape from what was essentially a forced marriage, Marcus said, his voice calm and clear. She's safe now. Somewhere Jeffrey Ashworth and her family can't force her to return. I take full responsibility for my actions. Within minutes, Marcus was surrounded by palace security. His weapon was removed, and he was placed under arrest. As they led him away from his post for the last time, he looked back at the reception hall where Jeffrey was now screaming at palace officials, demanding that they find his missing wife and bring her back immediately. But Marcus knew they wouldn't find her. Sarah was too good at what she did, and Catherine was already well on her way to a new life. The cost had been enormous for both of them, but the principle had been worth it. Sometimes Marcus realized the most honorable thing a soldier could do was to stop following orders. 6 months later, Marcus sat in a small cafe in Edinburgh, reading a letter that had arrived without a return address. He had been expecting it for weeks, ever since Sarah had told him that Catherine had asked for his contact information. Letter was brief, written in careful handwriting that showed both nervousness and determination. "Dear Marcus," it began, "I hope this letter finds you well. I hope you won't think it presumptuous of me to write to you after all this time. I wanted you to know what has happened since that day when you gave me back my life." Marcus had spent the last 6 months rebuilding his own life from scratch. The court-martial had been swift and predictable. He was found guilty of abandoning his post and interfering with official palace business. He lost his commission, his pension, and faced a suspended prison sentence that would hang over him for the next 5 years. The military career that had defined his adult life was over. His name had become synonymous with disgrace in the circles where he had once been respected. But even in the darkest moments of his legal proceedings, Marcus had never regretted his decision. The testimony he gave during his court-martial had been detailed and unflinching. He explained exactly why he had chosen to help Catherine escape, describing the financial coercion, Jeffrey Ashworth's questionable character, and the institutional failure that had allowed such a marriage to be sanctioned. His testimony had been widely reported in the media, sparking a national conversation about arranged marriages and the abuse of traditional authority. The public reaction had been mixed but largely supportive. While some criticized Marcus for breaking his oath and abandoning his duty, many more praised him as a hero who had stood up for human dignity against institutional abuse. Women's rights organizations had rallied to his cause. An illegal defense fund had been established to help with his court costs. The letter continued, "I am now living under a new name in a small town in Scotland, working as a teaching assistant at the local primary school. It's not the life I was raised to expect, but it's the life I chose, and that makes all the difference. Every morning when I wake up, I remember that I am free to make my own decisions, to choose my own path, and I think of you and what you sacrificed to make that possible." Marcus smiled as he read these words. After his discharge from the military, he had struggled to find work. His public disgrace had made him unemployable in security or law enforcement, and many employers were reluctant to hire someone with his notoriety. Eventually, he had found work with a small non-profit organization that helped veterans transition to civilian life. The pay was modest, but the work was meaningful. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus felt like he was helping people, rather than simply following orders. "I want you to know that Jeffrey has tried several times to find me and force me to return. He hired private investigators and even attempted to use his political connections to track me down. But Sarah's network has protected me completely. The marriage has been annulled on grounds of coercion, and I am legally free. Jeffrey's reputation has suffered considerably from the scandal, and several of his business deals have fallen through as a result of the negative publicity." This news brought Marcus's particular satisfaction. One of his greatest fears had been that Catherine's escape would be temporary. She would eventually be found and forced back into the marriage. Knowing that she was not only free but legally protected gave meaning to all the sacrifices he had made. The letter went on to describe Catherine's new life in detail. She had enrolled in university courses to become a qualified teacher, was learning to manage her own finances, and had even begun dating someone she had met at church, a local mechanic who knew nothing of her aristocratic background and loved her for who she was, not what she represented. "I have also been in touch with my family," the letter continued. "My father was furious at first, but as the months had passed, he has begun to understand that what he was asking of me was wrong. My mother admitted that she had been against the marriage from the beginning but felt powerless to stop it. My younger siblings have been supportive throughout. I believe my actions may have freed them from feeling obligated to make similar sacrifices in the future." Marcus had heard through Sarah that Catherine's family had indeed lost their estate, but had managed to avoid complete financial ruin by selling properties and downsizing their lifestyle dramatically. It had been a difficult adjustment, but they had survived without sacrificing their daughter's freedom. But I want you to know that the most important thing I've learned is something you taught me in those few minutes on the palace balcony. That honor isn't about following rules blindly, but about standing up for what's right even when it costs you everything. Showed me what real courage looks like, and I try every day to live up to that example." The letter was signed simply C with no last name, maintaining the anonymity that protected her new life. But included with the letter was a small photograph, Catherine, in casual clothes, as standing in front of a Scottish loch, smiling genuinely for what might have been the first time in her life. Marcus folded the letter carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. As he walked home through the Edinburgh streets, he reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. 6 months ago, he had been Captain Marcus Whitfield, a decorated Royal Guard with an impeccable record and a promising military career. Now he was simply Marcus, a disgraced former soldier working for a small charity and living in a rented flat. By any conventional measure, his life had been ruined by the decision he made that September afternoon. It lost his career, his reputation, his financial security, and the respect of many people who had once admired him. His father still refused to speak to him. Several old friends had distanced themselves from the controversy. But as Marcus reached his flat and prepared for another evening alone, realized that he had never been happier. For the first time in his adult life, he was living according to his own moral compass rather than someone else's orders. He had saved a young woman from a life of misery and had struck a blow against a system that treated people as commodities to be traded for financial and political advantage. The next morning, Marcus received a phone call that would mark the beginning of the next chapter of his life. It was from an investigative journalist who had been following his story and wanted to collaborate on a book about corruption and abuse within traditional British institutions. The project would give Marcus a platform to continue fighting for. The principles he had discovered were more important than career or reputation, as he agreed to the meeting. Marcus thought about the young guards who were still standing at their posts at palaces around London. He hoped that if they ever faced a similar choice between blind obedience and moral courage, they would remember his example and choose to stand up for what was right, regardless of the cost. The photograph of Catherine by the Scottish loch remained on his mantelpiece, a daily reminder that sometimes the most important victories were the quiet ones. A young woman free to choose her own future. A principle upheld despite institutional pressure, and the knowledge that honor sometimes required the courage to rebel against the very institutions you had sworn to serve. In the end, Marcus had learned that true loyalty wasn't about following orders without question, but about serving the highest ideals of justice and human dignity, even when those ideals conflicted with authority. His silent rebellion had cost him everything he thought he valued, but had given him something far more precious, the ability to sleep peacefully, knowing that when it mattered most, he had chosen to do what was right.